I just threw the rule book out the window with gardening, and I thought, no, I'm just going to experiment with this and see how it works. And I started in a very small space to begin with because I felt I was being a bit naughty doing this, and then saw how productive it was. And then I expanded it to pretty much the whole of my gardens.
You're listening to the Food Garden Life Show, the show that brings together gardening, food, and the human story. I'm your host, Emma Biggs.
And I'm Stephen Biggs. We talk to creative food gardeners and farm and garden experts who break the rules and make new ones too. Today's episode is about being less in control of our gardens. Less control for a more resilient garden. This might be a stretch for you perfectionists out there, and as a reformed or reforming perfectionist, I gotta say that it can be hard to let go. So stay tuned for ideas around simplicity, resilience, and do-it-yourself gardening. Today, we head to the UK to chat with Kim Stoddart. Before we get to today's chat, a quick announcement. This episode is our spring finale. Emma's wrapping up high school and heading to a summer job in Algonquin Park for the summer. So now I'll have twice as much garden to manage, and I'm planning to double down on the veg garden. We'll be back to take you to meet more inspiring gardeners in the fall. And in the meantime, you can drop by foodgardenlife.com to say hi. We'd love to hear from you. Now, here's today's interview, which is from our last live radio show. Kim Stoddart's a homesteader, avid food gardener, award-winning writer and journalist, and an educator. Kim gardens in Wales in the UK, and it's great to connect here on the show because I've long enjoyed her work in Grow Your Own magazine and in The Guardian. Kim has a new book out called The Climate Change Garden, down-to-earth advice for growing a resilient garden. And we'll dig into ideas from her book today, from the perspective of veggie gardeners. And by the way, even if you're not in the UK, Kim has online courses, and you can find Kim and the courses online at greenrocketcourses.com. That's greenrocketcourses.com. And without further ado, let's get Kim on the line. Kim, welcome to the show.
Hello there, Stephen and Emma. Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to talk to you and talk about the new book. And let's start by talking about, what does a climate change veggie garden look like for you?
Oh, there's so much to say. It's my favorite topic. You'll be glad to hear. I've been writing about climate change and resilience since about 2013, and I first started doing so in The Guardian when I did a series of gardening for free articles, and that's really informed the approach that I take today. And I think back then, when I used to do talks for gardening clubs, I'd have to really justify that climate change was happening. But as you've both said, you've got wildfires, unfortunately, at the moment, and there's so many greater extremes of weather that we're experiencing. So in terms of a resilient garden, there's the key things I would say with that are very much about no-till, no-dig, as we call it in the UK. Working with natural systems, I would call it now nature first gardening. So it's about having a productive vegetable patch, but one which really looks to the natural world for inspiration and support for resilience. Very much about free planting as well, which is also known as polyculture in permaculture circles, and very much boosting biodiversity. So you're looking at having a massive array of natural predators in your garden space to help deal with greater threat of pest and disease. But also a climate change savvy garden needs to be fun. So for me, it's very much about enjoying your outside space, and it's about the well-being factor as well. And when you have a space that is truly alive and biodiverse, and the natural systems can come into play to mean that it's less work for you as a gardener and more time to actually enjoy the garden. So the more carefully, meticulously controlled, primped and polished style of garden is no longer fit for purpose. It's actually much more vulnerable to the greater extremes of weather.
Well, let's talk about some of those things that you just mentioned a little bit more. You talked about no-till and polyculture and boosting biodiversity, among other things. Can we dig into polyculture a little bit more for people who aren't familiar with it?
Oh, absolutely. It's probably good if I explain how I first came upon this. So what happened is when I moved to my homestead in West Wales, this was about 12 years ago, I did what you're supposed to do. I planted long rows of tomatoes in the polytunnels here in the very high hills of West Wales, because you can't grow tomatoes outside. And blight, unfortunately, struck. And I was looking at the tomatoes and I was thinking, why am I planting these tomatoes so closely together, which actually enables the airborne fungus, which is blight, to move from plant to plant and leaf to leaf? So purely by experimentation, I just decided to start mixed planting, as I called it then. I didn't even know there was a thing called polyculture in permaculture circles. So it was very much about tapping into innate instinct and thinking, well, what can I do? How can I work with this? And also combined with the fact that I was using a crop rotation system. And because my gardens, the homestead is 2.3 acres and the gardens are about a third of an acre. So I had pages upon pages of exacting rotation plans. And it used to make my head whirl, thinking what follows what, and oh, people are saying different things. And so actually that got wet one day. And again, the two combined, I just threw the rule book out the window with gardening. And I thought, no, I'm just going to experiment with this and see how it works. And I started in a very small space to begin with, because I felt I was being a bit naughty doing this, and then saw how productive it was. And then I expanded it to pretty much the whole of my gardens. And the golden rule really is to have at least about 6 foot between plants of the same family. So, for example, tomatoes, to have that space between them makes it much harder for the blight to spread. And you can use lots of very light on the soil plants, filler plants like summer herbs, like your basils and salad leaves, as fillers in between to use as ground cover. I advise people to start in a small space to begin with, because it's a bit like a blank canvas, because we're very used to planting and exacting lines, and you can still have symmetry, but it's very much about making gardening your own. And from a pest and disease perspective as well, if we look at pests, if you imagine if you have a big block of carrots, in a way, you might as well put a sign up saying carrot fly come this way, because it's so much easier for the carrot fly to sniff out the carrot foliage and move in. So it's a bit like companion planting, just on a much bigger, more free-spirited scale.
Well, we have a couple emails that have come in, Kim. And first of all, from Carl, who's enjoying the chat, and just a shout out to say hello. Thanks, Carl. And Hank is asking about resilient plants for the change that's happening in the world. What would you tell people who are interested in knowing about resilient plants? And maybe we'll come at it from the vegetable angle. Suggestions?
It's a really good question. I think there's lots of different examples of plants that are likely to suffer in the future with our changing climate. And there are also wild food projects which are researching the wild ancestors of some of our more commercially available crops, like, say, for example, the carrot, to see if they offer solutions for the future. So there's lots of things happening. And I think really, though, what might be better to look at with that is actually how you grow. So say, for example, with a tomato plant, what I do, because I should also explain that where I live, I have a private well. So the last few summers, it's been running incredibly dry during the summer. And last year, I was down to 10 gallons of water a day, which isn't enough for the house, let alone for the vegetable garden. So my plants have had to go for weeks without having hardly any water at all. So it's how you garden. So building the actual microbial activity, the likes of the mycorrhizal fungi in the soil, can actually work fantastically to help plants find food and water. So if you take a tomato, you can actually trail the stem along the ground. So the plant is getting food and water from more than one place. And being inspired by the natural world, I recall going on holiday to countries like Spain and Greece and seeing tomatoes growing wild. beside the roadside. And I thought, well, why don't I try that? And it's amazing how far the plants can actually become resilient just by leaving them to trail and to boost into those natural systems that are there. So although there are some crops that will fare better in the future than others, it's very much about how you garden.
It's really interesting. And I love that idea of just looking at how those tomato plants grow in the wild and then
Yes.
mimicking that in the garden. Oh, I wanted to mention that something jumped out at me when you were talking about what a climate change garden is for you. And you'd mentioned enjoying the space and this idea of well-being. And that really touched me because I think sometimes in gardening it can be very prescriptive and it stresses people. So that's such an important point, and I'm really happy that you mentioned that.
Thank you. Absolutely. I think I sort of touched upon it earlier when I said that I did this gardening for free adventure for The Guardian. That was this idea, can Kim garden entirely for free? And yes, I could. So when I was actually doing this, I had to take the rule book and throw it out the window because I had to figure out how not to spend any money. So I looked to the natural world, I looked to the past for inspiration for the future. And it made me realize that it's really important to be able to think on your feet with things like this and to build confidence. So, say, for example, something like making leaf mold is massively confidence building to know that you're not completely reliant on buying everything in. It feels amazing. So,
Hmm.
with climate change, because we're dealing with the who knows what, again, topsy-turvy weather, it's flitting from one extreme to the other. The ability to actually problem solve and to think creatively around whatever that challenge is in the here and then is massively important. And taking time to be mindful, and it's called emotional regulation. It's tapping into the prefrontal cortex in your brain, which enables you to make executive decisions on things. So to think creatively. And thing is, if you've got a long to-do list and you're charging around thinking, feeling guilty, a lot of gardeners feel guilty a lot of the time. Oh, I haven't done this or I haven't done that. And when you're in that state, it's much harder to think creatively. So I say to people, if anyone says, oh, you're not working hard enough, just say to them they're tapping into the prefrontal cortex in their brain for executive decision making. I think that will probably shut that down quite quickly.
I love it.
Okay, nice.
Coming up, we talk about veggie gardening in hot summers, we talk about trees, and about soil mixes. That's coming up in just a moment. We have some shout outs today and a shout out to Cody. Cody, glad you enjoyed the last live show and are checking out the podcast, so I hope you hear this. And to Ed, thanks for tuning in to the last live show, all 6 of you and your crew. Also a shout out today to everybody who's in the live fig camp. We had part 1 of live fig camp a couple nights ago, part 2 is tonight, and I'm really excited because we have cold climate fig growers from coast to coast, and it's a real privilege to hang out with all of you and talk figs. Some new content on foodgardenlife.com, an article about how to make fig leaf syrup, and a lot of people don't realize that you can use fig leaves in the kitchen. I like to make fig leaf panna cotta, fig leaf granita, but new on the website, the fig leaf syrup. I did a post on it because we were talking about it at Fig Camp. A beautiful syrup to put on fruit like blueberries, raspberries. You can also, though, drizzle it on meat. If you're doing, say, chicken or fish, it's a beautiful adornment to that. Another new piece on foodgardenlife.com is about heat-tolerant greens for the summer. If you have trouble getting leafy greens in the middle of the summer, if your lettuce and your spinach and arugula are all bolting, here are some other ideas for you. And I mentioned in the beginning that Emma will be working at Algonquin Park this summer, and for those of you interested in camping, we have a piece on the site all about family backcountry camping. All of this at foodgardenlife.com. You're listening to the Food Garden Life Show, the show that brings together gardening, food, and the human story, with your hosts Emma Biggs and me, Stephen Biggs. Now, back to our chat with Kim Stoddart.
Okay, let's talk about some tips for veggie gardening in hot summers, because you just said that last year a lot of your plants were growing without a lot of water. So what are some of your tips for people to do that?
There's quite a few things. I'll start with the most straightforward one, which I think most people are familiar with, just as a recap, but it's when you water. So watering either early in the day or later in the evening means that there's less chance of the precious water evaporating away. So that is absolutely key. Also, it's very much about watering deeply. So a lot of the time people water, and if it's a surface water, it's much more inclined to dry out quite quickly. So if you can actually water the soil and water deeply, you can do so less often. So what that enables is for the water to permeate down deeper into the soil, and it can stay there for longer. You can also, around particularly water hungry plants like your tomatoes, your eggplant, you can also apply a mulch. Mulches, I call them magic mulches. So they're such a fantastic resilient tool for the gardener. So you can use things like comfrey chopped up or just thrown down. You can use very thin layer of grass clippings, thin layer of wood chip, compost, leaf mold, amazing leaf mold. And this also helps to keep the water in. The other thing is to try and not have any bare soil. So in the mixed planting, the free planting system that I employ, I fill every available gap with something. So even the likes of winter squash, their leaves can trail around the veg patch. And I use a lot of filler plants like nasturtium, I use calendula, I use lettuce, maximizing the growing space that you have with loads of plants. I love brightly colored flowers as well. So I have lots of wildflowers that I also allow to grow. Brilliant for wildlife, brilliant for pollinators, and it just makes me smile, and it works incredibly well. And the other thing, which is really, really important, is to know that with plants that become overfed and overwatered, they become quite lazy. So they won't develop such deep roots because they don't need to, because you're giving them everything they need. So the more that you can step back and water less, but water deeply, the more resilient your plants can also be. And you can also grow some plants on for longer. So we think about perennials as being an absolute must for a climate change savvy garden, which they are. But actually, certain plants can be grown on for a longer period of time, and they can tap into some of those benefits. So the likes of Swiss chard and purple sprouting broccoli, and also kale, can be grown on for at least a few years.
So having those perennials then really makes it a lower input, I guess, garden, and that can be very beneficial.
Absolutely. And they can shake off pests quite often, much more easily, because they have those deeper root systems. They have that connection with the amazing, amazing biodiversity below ground. We're very much at the tip of the iceberg in terms of our understanding about soil health and the soil wide web. And to do that provides them with food, water, and support as well, which is absolutely fantastic.
Okay. Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. We just had a question emailed in from Eric who's asking, what is, the real impact and the benefits of gardening for growing flowers and veggies for climate change?
Well, I think with the traditional ways of gardening, it's all been very much about exacting do's and don'ts, and it's very much been based on relatively recent manor house methods of gardening. So if you actually look back before that, then that's really what I'm channeling with the type of gardening I do. It's much more about working with natural systems. I'm really busy also writing and doing lots of different things, running courses. So I need a garden that's hugely productive, that puts food on the table, that that informs my work, but is also very, very low maintenance to work with. And that's what a climate change savvy garden is as well. This idea of keeping nature so meticulously controlled is just really creating a space that's incredibly vulnerable. And I think the thing with climate change gardening is it's very much about building resilience in the gardener as much as it is the actual garden, because we're living through such stressful times. So there's a myriad of things we've had to cope with in the last few years. And we have climate change in the mix. So this is very much about creating space for us to tune into those natural instincts that are there to help us problem solve and work with the natural world, which has potential to soothe and heal us and help us cope with the horrible things we keep hearing in the news.
Well, we have a couple emails in, and let's see. Brian emailed in because he's tuned in late and he's asking about Emma's greenhouse. Brian, did you have to rub that in? I didn't get it yet. And then, Kim, we had an email from Gail who's just asking about what about trees and how do they fit into this picture?
Oh, there's so much to say about trees. I should probably mention there's a whole chapter on trees in the climate change garden book because they play such an incredibly important role. I think we're focusing more on the vegetable patch side of things, so vegetable resilient garden, but there's trees provide so much benefit from carbon capture to cooling impact on city streets to homes. There's so many benefits with regards to the planting of trees. But actually a good example with that as well, to personalize it, is that where I live, I'm about 750 foot above sea level in a very, very exposed spot. And I was categorically told when I moved here, you can't grow fruit trees. You can't grow fruit trees. You can't do it. I've tried, doesn't work. You cannot grow fruit trees. So I immediately thought, well, I really want to grow fruit trees. So I'm determined to try and grow fruit trees. So I did research, I asked about, and I found that by creating a bit of a forest garden effect, I've got damson trees and wild plum along the westerly side, which provides protection against the wind. And I've got layers, I've got other trees and shrubs providing protection. And yes, I can grow fruit trees. So if there's a will, there's a way, but really biodiversity of planting is absolutely key with trees because there's differing advice on which trees are going to fare well in the future. So the more variety of tree that you can have, wild varieties of fruit trees are also worth looking at, the better able you will be to have productive trees for the future.
We just had another email come in, and this one's from Jamie and asking about what are peat-free soil mixes. And I wonder if you can elaborate on that. And I know certainly that the peat-free trend and mindset is much more far advanced in the UK than it is here in North America.
Absolutely. It's a huge topic, and the reasons for going peat-free are huge, and it's a massive part of the campaign for climate change friendly gardening. But with the actual quality of peat-free mixes, that can be slightly challenged. And actually in the UK, what we have found is because there's legislation that's coming in with the banning of peat-based compost, there's been some challenges over quality of the commercially available peat-free compost you can buy. So to make your own anyway is really, really good. So a few ideas for that. One of the best things I would recommend is using leaf mold, which can be used as 100% seed compost. So I experimented with this back for the Guardian 2013, and I'm doing it now, and it works incredibly well. If you look it up online, there's loads of really elaborate mixes where you're supposed to put 10% this with 10% that and 80% leaf mold, but actually you can just use 100% leaf mold to plant your seeds into. You might get the odd weed seed germinating, but it should be quite straightforward to see. But otherwise, in terms of what you actually apply as a peat-free compost, making your own is one of the best things you can do. Like seed saving, it's one of the best things you can do. It provides you with a fantastic material for free, which is completely peat-free, but also it builds confidence. And what a great thing to do, to take those kitchen scraps and those waste items from the garden and turn it into such a fantastic material for the veg patch, for the garden. So that's a definite. And you can supercharge your compost with things like, if you live near a beach, seaweed. You can use comfrey. If you have chickens, you can use chicken bedding, nettles. There's all sorts of things you can do. And then I mentioned about mulches before, and I get very, very excited about mulches because they are an amazing tool for the climate change savvy garden. So you can use these to improve the soil as well throughout the year. What I did over winter was I experimented the last few years with using leaves, just leaves, they haven't broken down, on the veg patch over winter to provide protection. And that also encourages earthworm activity, microbial activity in the soil. And it's just fantastic. So a lot of the things you can do are free.
Great. Well, you've shared so much amazing advice for us, and I'm sure our listeners will be keen to get more about climate change gardening. So, can you tell us about your book?
Oh, thank you, Emma. Yeah, the book is being published by Cool Springs Press, which is part of the Quarto Group, and it's a new updated version of a book that Sally Morgan and I wrote back in 2019. So Sally and I met up and we had a very sparky conversation about there being a real need for a guide for gardeners. So that came out in 2019 for a UK audience. And this new updated global guide is it's perfect for gardeners everywhere, and it has lots of new chapters and images and introduction, and it's very solution focused. It's looking at the challenges that we face, but very much looking at the solutions and showing how we can use this to our advantage with the gardens that we create to make them more resilient. So we try and make it as upbeat as possible because it is very stressful for people, but we want people to know there are a lot of things they can do. So the book is absolutely packed full of tips, advice, inspiration. And these are all methods that Sally and I have tried and tested over the years, and inspiration we've sought from around the world. Actually, I should mention also my gardens are flooded. So I've got swale and there's lots of things I've done to actually shore up the defences. So again, it's being prepared for whatever the weather.
It's a lovely book, and I should just say one of the things I jotted down as we've been chatting is this idea of less control that really jumped out at me, and that was a theme that came out to me as I was going through the book too, Kim.
It is. I think it's gardening is such a wonderful, wonderful thing. The ability to grow food, to nurture a seed into a plant that can bring food to the table is amazing. And it's one of the best things you can do from a climate change perspective. There's less plastic. It gives you a hope for the future, hope for the future for us all to actually be able to have that connection with our food. And the thing with all of this is that we've been so used to following the exacting instructions, but know that before, a lot of the traditional gardening is only relatively recent. So actually, if you look back to our forefathers and mothers, actually the way they gardened was much more in tune with the natural world. So really, we're just channeling that. There didn't used to be multifarious garden centres with 24/7 options to buy things. And I like buying things, but actually, if you can repurpose something, if you can take a pallet or an old sink and turn it into a pond or a planter, it makes you feel really, really good to take items that would otherwise go to waste and turn it into something amazing. It's a positive action. It's sowing seed, plant by plant, upcycled item by upcycled item. This is all part of the solution for us moving forwards. And also working with others. I think that's absolutely key because we're all in this together.
Now, we're almost out of time, but can you quickly also tell us about your courses?
Oh, yes, thank you. Yeah, I've been running courses since about 2014, and I run an array of different courses for the RHS, Kate Humble's farm, and for my own training gardens in it's the west of Wales. So I do generally a lot of teaching around, as you would imagine, climate change resilience, but also money saving. I do a lot of work around working with social housing providers, people on low incomes, teaching them how to save money in the garden. But also I do a lot of work around all year round growing, polytunnel, undercover growing. And it's all very much about building resilience in the garden. So I get asked to do all sorts of different talks. I'm, very versatile. I've also done work with young disabled adults as well. So I do a lot around the well-being side with gardening. So I just think gardening is such an amazing thing to do. Obviously, I'm biased, given it's what I do for a living, but everyone should have the opportunity to grow some food and to garden.
Indeed. Great. Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you and learning about your book, and you shared so many great tips today. So thank you for joining us on the show.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye now.
Take care. Bye.
Bye. That was gardener, educator, and author Kim Stoddart. Find Kim at greenrocketcourses.com.
That was our chat with Kim Stoddart, and Kim is the co-author of the book The Climate Change Garden, Down-to-Earth Advice for Growing a Resilient Garden. You can find Kim at greenrocketcourses.com. What did you think? Kim talks about being naughty and throwing that rule book out the window, and I like that. I was also interested in Kim's approach to doing more yourself and buying less for the garden. As we wrap up today's episode, I'm thinking about what Kim was saying about polycultures. As I think about polycultures, I think that we, the gardeners, become less the masters and a little bit more like curators. The podcast returns in the fall, and I hope you have a fantastic summer. We'd love it if you drop by to say hi online at foodgardenlife.com. We have articles about growing fruit, veg, using your homegrown produce, also about growing figs and lemons in cold climates. So say hi. Tell us the topics that would help you grow more of your own. And you'll also get to see the faces that go with these voices that you hear on the podcast. While you're at foodgardenlife.com, also grab our free newsletter. Subscribers get the subscriber-only cold climate fig guide and small space food gardening tip sheet.
And you can find me on my website, emmabiggs.ca, and on Instagram as emmabiggs_grows.
You're listening to the Food Garden Life Show. I'm Stephen Biggs.
And I'm Emma Biggs. Thanks for tuning in.